Welcome to episode 4 of my Kawasaki Z1 900 engine rebuild, and in this episode I'm going to be refitting the cylinder head, fitting the camshafts and doing the cam timing. The first thing I'm going to do is fit a new seal around the cam chain tunnel. On the Z1 engine, oil is fed up the outer studs on the cylinder block, and these are sealed at the top by copper washers under the cylinder head nuts, so if you're going to reuse the copper washers they first need to be annealed. There are several ways of annealing copper, but the one I choose to use is using a blowtorch, heat the copper up to its cherry red and dropping it into cold water. This makes it all soft and supple, and perfect for making an oil-tight seal. There we go, that's just perfect. I now fit 2 new cylinder head gaskets, one each side, then lower the head down into place. With the 2 location dowels engaged, I can now fit the copper washers to the cylinder head studs. With all 12 copper cylinder head washers fitted, I can now start screwing down the cylinder head nuts by hand. I then fit the 2 M6 bolts, one each side, by the spark plug hole. I use a 14mm socket and extension bar for fitting the centre nuts, because they're quite deeply recessed into the cylinder head and hard to reach by hand. With all the cylinder head nuts loosely fitted, I go around with my ratchet wrench and tighten them up in sequence. With all the cylinder head nuts tightened, the engine's starting to look really good now. Charlie Weaver has a little tipple to celebrate. I can hear some noise in the kitchen, so I go to investigate what's going on. Hopefully Tracy's making some more cupcakes, and she is. I know it's that Charlie and his best friend Charlie are revigilating the cooking, making sure that nothing's missed out of the recipe book. They keep gazing out the window at the pigeons, but that's strange. But anyway, in goes the mincemeat, because these are going to be Christmas cupcakes. It is a bit early to be talking about Christmas, but Tracy likes to practice before to make sure they're just perfect for the Christmas season. With all the ingredients mixed, it's time to scoop out the mixture and put it into the cupcake cases in exact quantities so all the cakes are exactly the same weight, because they need to be the same size. She then puts them in the oven and cooks them at exactly 180 degrees C for 20 minutes. When the time's up, she gets them out of the oven and puts them on the side to cool, but she first checked they're cooked properly by dipping them with some sort of spike. It looks like an old spoke, but I think it is some cooking implement that checks if they're cooked, because if they're not cooked, the spike comes out slimy. Back in the garage, the next thing I need to do is set the crankshaft at top dead centre for the outer 2 cylinders. Then I can retrieve the cam chain from the tunnel using a magnet. The next thing I'm going to do is put some oil on the white metal camshaft bearings, ready to install the camshafts. The camshafts are marked left and right. Starting with the exhaust camshaft, this is easily recognisable because it has the scroll for the rev counter drive. I engage the chain and slide it into the cylinder head. I pull the chain tight over the camshaft sprocket, making sure it's engaged nicely with the roller and engaged with the bottom sprocket on the crankshaft, then align the mark up with the cylinder head. The camshaft has 3 bolts. The 2 close together go towards the centre of the engine, and the one on its own points towards the front of the engine, aligning the mark with the base of the cylinder head. There's also a notch in the end of the camshaft which lines up nicely. Before going any further, I check that the mark on the crankshaft still lines up with the mark on the crankcases, and it does. I can now install the inlet camshaft, sliding it nicely under the chain, with the left on the left side of the engine. The inlet camshaft is installed with a single bolt facing rearwards. Camshafts are held in place with 4 caps containing the white metal bearings. The arrows always point forwards and are numbered 1, 2, 3 and 4, which line up with corresponding marks on the cylinder head. I replace these 4 caps in place and tighten them up loosely initially, gradually drawing the camshafts down onto the cylinder head. With the exhaust camshaft fitted, I can now fit the inlet camshaft, but first put some oil on the bearings. With the screws loosely fitted, I then tighten them down evenly until the camshaft's drawn into the cylinder head like the exhaust cam. With both the camshafts clamped in place, I can now check the timing of the engine. With the centre line of the front mounting bolt for the exhaust camshaft lined up with the top surface of the cylinder head, the very next pin you start counting from, that's pin number 1, then it's pin number 2, number 3, right the way around to pin number 28, which should line up with a corresponding mark on the inlet camshaft. And there we go, it lines up just perfect. One last check that the crankshaft hasn't moved and the 2 timing marks still align, and then we can fit the central idler sprocket. I carefully lower the central idler sprocket down onto the cylinder head, being careful not to drop any of the steel spacers and washers down into the engine. I can then tighten the 4 bolts. The last thing to fit is the cam chain tensioner. This bolts onto the back of the engine with 2 bolts. This is in actual fact a later style automatic tensioner fitted to the Z1000, but it works great on the Z900 engine. So you do up the 2 main bolts, then loosen the centre nut, then retighten it again, and the cam chain tensioner springs into life, tensioning the chain. And as the engine runs and the chain stretches, it gradually adjusts itself automatically. With the new O-ring and seal fitted, I carefully slide in the rev counter drive until it engages nicely with the worm on the camshaft, then do up the securing screw tight. This next stage is a very important check. I use a ratchet spanner on the end of the crankshaft and very carefully turn it over slowly 2 revolutions of the crankshaft so the engine's gone for its full 4-stroke cycle to make sure nothing's hitting inside. If you feel anything tight, it's when you have to stop and start and recheck. But in this case, everything was absolutely perfect. After the 2 revolutions, I gradually tap the crankshaft round until the marks just line up nicely on the crankshaft, and double check the camshaft timing marks and they're still in line perfectly, so that's great. So now I can give it a kick over on the kickstart for the very first time, and it feels like a real engine. Well, that's perfect timing. There's a tap at the door and it's Tracy with a cupcake and a cup of tea. How cool is that? The cakes have cooled down, but they're still warm, which is just perfect, and they tasted amazing. With the cake eaten and the wrapper in the bin, it's time for the next stage, which is doing the valve clearances. Using a 17mm ratchet spanner, I gradually turn the engine over until the inlet valve on number 1 cylinder is pointing right upwards to give the maximum clearance to check for clearances. I ease in a 2 thou clearance gauge, feeler gauge, and it goes straight and lovely and moves around with ease, so that one's just right. So now I can move on to the next one. I turn the engine with the ratchet spanner to get the next valve in the up position, with the load pointing the furthest distance away from the bucket. I tried the 2 thou feeler gauge and it won't go in at all, so I need to replace the shim for a thinner shim. To do this, I use this special tool that holds the bucket down to allow me to remove the shim with a magnet. So I rotate the engine using my ratchet spanner until the bucket is pushed right down by the cam lobe. Then I can insert this tool underneath, just resting it on the edge of the bucket. Then you turn the engine backwards to allow the bucket to come back up, and this tool holds it down. Then you can use a magnet or a little screwdriver to hook the shim out. With the shim removed, the number on the back side is the thickness in millimetres, so this is 2.85mm thick. So what I need is a 2.8mm thick, which is 0.05 less than the other one, which is equal to 0.02 of an inch. With the new shim in place, I rotate the engine and remove the special tool. Then I can check the clearance on my feeler gauges. With the cam lobe pointing upwards away from the valve, I check the clearance initially with my 2 thou feeler gauge, and that slides in quite loose. So I try the 3 thou feeler gauge, and that won't go in at all. So that's just perfect. So it's just over 2 thou, which is just nice. I then rotate the engine to get the next valve to line up on the inlet camshaft. And then when I check this one with my 2 thou feeler gauge, it slides in just nicely. So that's good, no attention needed on that one. So then we can progress to the next one. The last 2 inlet valves are in spec, so no further adjustment was needed. So then I went across to the camshaft on the exhaust side, set these slightly thicker clearances because the exhaust valves always run hotter than the inlet valves, so they're more likely to expand a little bit more in their length, closing up the gap. So I set them between 3 and 4 thou. With all the valves adjusted, I put some silicone sealer on the end caps and put them in place. Then I fit the new cam cover gasket, followed by the cam cover. These are a bit fiddly to fit, you have to sort of guide them down, but they drop down eventually. The cam cover is held on with 16 chrome-plated hexagon bolts, so I screw these all down by finger first, then tighten them up with my T-wrench. With the cam cover firmly bolted in place, the next thing I'm going to do before I fit the engine in the frame is fit the points plate and do the ignition timing. The 4-cylinder Z1 engine runs a weighted spark system for ignition, where one set of points fires the outer 2 cylinders, another set of points fires the inner 2 cylinders with coils with twin leads. The points are held in a points casing on the right hand side of the engine and can be adjusted easily. With the points plate fitted, the first thing I'm going to do is adjust the gap to get the maximum gap you can get by turning the crankshaft until the points open to their widest position and check the clearance. I checked the clearance with a feeler gauge and it's 14 thou, which is just perfect, so I'm really pleased about that. I then connect a battery and a bulb to the output wire from the points being checked and check the firing position by turning the crankshaft until the light goes out. The second the light goes out is the position where it would fire the spark plugs, and this has to line up with 2 marks, one on the engine and one on the crankshaft. I stop rotating the crankshaft the second the light goes out and check the positions, and they're slightly out. So I loosen the 2 retaining screws and adjust the points very slightly until the light comes on again. And then when I turn the crankshaft this time, it goes out in the correct position. With the first set of points done, it's now just a case of repeating the procedure on the second set of points, then I can put the points cover on with a new gasket. Before going any further with the build, I'm going to fit the engine in the frame because the alternator and the starter motor are quite heavy, and I'll fit those later. The original alternator windings look in immaculate condition, so I'm going to reuse them, but first I'm going to clean the casing out on the inside to remove any traces of oil and grease with some brake cleaner. The brake cleaner removes any traces of oil at the point where the wires come through from the alternator, so I need to seal these in place with silicone to prevent them from leaking. So I'll give it a good clean on that as well, making sure all the oil is removed. With the connector block cleaned and dry and free from oil, I use some Permatex Ultra Grey gasket sealer quite a lot to make sure it doesn't leak. You can always wipe it off afterwards. This is quite a common leak point on the Kawasaki Z1 engine, especially if you're reusing the old connector block which has gone hard. But with a bit of silicone on there, it'd be perfectly leak tight. I'm now ready to lower the alternator winding into the casing, lining up the connector block as I go to make sure it sits nicely and all the gasket sealer oozes out around it. I can then fit the 3 screws to hold it all in place. These are cap head screws, so I tighten them with an Allen key. I now check all the alternator and starter gears are ready for assembly and give them a clean. parts appear to be in excellent condition with very minimal wear. With the engine bolted nicely in the frame, I can now start assembling the alternator components onto the end of the crankshaft. First fitting a thrust washer, followed by a needle roller bearing, then the starter ring gear. Then there's another thrust washer, followed by the woodruff key. These can be quite tight fit and a bit fiddly to fit. And last of all, the alternator actual rotor itself, the magnet part, is then gently pushed on, rotating it slightly as you push it on to engage the starter clutch rollers onto the actual starter ring gear, and also line up the woodruff key with the slot. The starter motor reduction idle gear then fits in behind, engaging nicely with the starter motor and the ring gear with a shaft in the centre. A quick check and it all spins freely, so that's really good. So now I can fit the special washer and central bolt, tightening with a ratchet spanner. With the central nut tightened, I can now fit a new gasket, followed by the alternator cover. I gently tap it onto its dowels, then fit all the screws and tighten fully. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and in the next episode I'll be stripping and cleaning the carburettors. We recently had a poorly hedgehog in our garden. It was seen out in the daylight, which usually means they're unwell, so we scooped it up and took it to our local Oxford Wildlife Centre, like a hospital for animals, and they were looking after it currently to bring it back into full health. Then it'd be returned to us, releasing back in the garden, which is really cool. But in the meantime, the hedgehogs are still coming at night. We've got about 8 now. They come regularly every night and consume vast quantities of food, but that's really cool, really. They even give the local cats a bit of a fright. And this little one was proper itchy.